The eviction notice had been sitting on Evelyn Blackwood's kitchen counter for 3 days, the red ink seeming to burn brighter each time she walked past it. 30 days. That was all she had left before she and her 6-year-old daughter Rosalie would be on the street. The paper felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds every time she picked it up to read it again, as if her hands could somehow find different words hidden between the lines. Evie stood at the window of their cramped Southern California apartment, watching Rosie play with her worn teddy bear on the living room floor, completely unaware that their world was about to collapse. The little girl hummed a song she had learned at school, her dark curls bouncing as she made the bear dance across the faded carpet. 6 years old and already learning to read the tension in her mother's shoulders, the way children of struggle learn to navigate storms they could not name. At 34, Evie had thought she would have figured it out by now. A stable job, a safe home, maybe even some savings tucked away for emergencies like the one she was drowning in. Instead, she was 3 months behind on rent, working double shifts at the hospital as a nurse's aide, and still coming up short every month by hundreds of dollars she simply could not find. Her ex-husband David had disappeared 2 years ago, leaving nothing but a mountain of debt that totaled $47,000 and promises that had shattered like glass under pressure. The divorce papers had arrived 6 months after he vanished, forwarded from some address in Arizona she had never known existed. No child support, no explanation, just gone, as if their 7 years together and the daughter they had made had meant nothing at all. Rosie's voice pulled her back. "Mama, are you okay?" Evie turned, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack her face in half. "Just thinking, baby. Finish your homework, okay?" The little girl's eyes studied her with an awareness no 6-year-old should possess. Children of struggle learn to read their parents' distress the way other kids learn to read picture books, parsing meaning from silences and shadows. That evening, after Rosie was asleep, Evie sat at her laptop, scrolling through rental listings with tears streaming down her face. Everything was too expensive, even in the worst neighborhoods. Studio apartments wanted first month, last month security deposit, nearly $5,000 just to get keys. She had already called every shelter in the city. The waiting lists were 6 months long, and the woman on the phone had been kind but clear. Unless there was immediate danger, domestic violence, they could not help. Her phone buzzed with a text from her older sister Grace in Phoenix. "I wish I could help, but with Miguel's medical bills, we're barely making it ourselves. I'm so sorry, Evie." The words blurred as fresh tears came. Evie typed back a quick reply saying she understood, then set the phone down and buried her face in her hands. She had always been the responsible one, the sister who made good choices, worked hard, did everything the way you were supposed to. How had it all fallen apart so completely? At 2 o'clock in the morning, unable to sleep. Despite her exhaustion, she found herself scrolling through obscure classified ads online. Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, old newspaper archives that had been digitized. She did not even know what she was looking for. Just something, anything that might offer a way out that did not involve living in her car with a first grader. That was when she saw it posted on a regional classified site she had never heard of, dated just 3 days earlier. Vintage railway passenger car, 1938, Union Pacific, located on private property, Carson Valley, Nevada. As his condition needs restoration, $500 or best offer serious inquiries only. Below was a grainy photograph of what looked like an old train car sitting on rusty tracks, surrounded by desert brush with mountains in the distance. The paint was faded, windows cracked, but there was something solid about it, something permanent. Evie stared at the advertisement for a full minute, her tired mind trying to process what she was seeing. A train car. An actual train car. It was crazy, completely insane. But she had $547 in her checking account, money she had scraped together for this month's partial rent payment money that would not matter once the eviction went through anyway. A train car was not a traditional home, but it had four walls and a roof. It existed somewhere in Nevada, which was only a few hours' drive from their apartment. Her finger hovered over the phone number listed. It was the middle of the night, but tomorrow she would have to call. She had to at least see what it was, because right now, this $500 train car sitting in the Nevada desert was the only thing standing between her daughter and homelessness. Evie did not know, could not have known, that the advertisement was more than just a desperate solution to her housing crisis. She did not know that something had been waiting inside that train car for 87 years, hidden in the walls, waiting for exactly the right person. Someone desperate enough, someone brave enough, someone who would care. The next morning, after dropping Rosie at school, Evie called the number with shaking hands. A woman answered on the fourth ring, her voice gravelly and aged, tinged with a distinctive Western drawl. "Yeah. Hi, I'm calling about the train car. The one in Carson Valley." There was a long pause on the other end, and Evie could hear wind in the background, the creak of something metal. "You serious? Most people think it's a joke." "I'm serious. Very serious. Is it still available?" The woman's laugh was short and sharp. "Yeah, it's available. Been trying to sell the damn thing for 2 years. You want to come see it?" Evie's heart pounded against her ribs. "Yes. When can I come?" "Hell, come whenever. I'm here all the time, got nowhere else to be. Name's Margaret Ashford. Call me when you're close and I'll meet you at the property." That afternoon, Evie called in sick to work for the first time in 18 months, picked up Rosie early from school with a story about a dentist appointment, and pointed their battered Toyota Corolla east toward Nevada. Rosie thought it was an adventure, chattering excitedly about missing school and going on a road trip completely unaware of the desperation driving every mile. "Where are we going, Mama?" "To see something special, baby. Something that might become our new home." "A new home? Like a new apartment?" Evie glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror. This beautiful child who deserved so much more than an exhausted mother and an uncertain future. "Something different. You'll see." The drive took them through the sprawling suburbs of Southern California, then up into the mountains where the air grew thinner and cleaner. Down the other side, the landscape transformed into the vast Nevada desert, endless sky and ancient rock formations painted in shades of rust and gold that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Carson Valley appeared like a mirage, a small cluster of buildings nestled between mountain ranges where ranches spread across valleys dotted with sagebrush and the occasional Joshua tree. Following Margaret's directions, Evie turned onto a dirt road that wound through scrubland for nearly 2 miles, the car bouncing over ruts and rocks. Dust billowed behind them in great clouds that caught the sunlight. And then there it was. Even from a distance, Evie could see the train car. It sat on a section of track that seemed to lead nowhere, surrounded by wild grass and desert flowers that had somehow found purchase in this harsh landscape. As they got closer, she could make out more details. The car was longer than she had expected, maybe 50 feet, with tall windows along both sides, and a curved roof that spoke of an era when trains were built with artistry as well as function. The paint, once a deep blue with gold trim, had faded to a ghostly azure, peeling in places to reveal patches of rust underneath. But the structure looked solid. The wheels sat firmly on the tracks without any visible sagging, and the frame had not buckled despite decades of desert weather. "Mama, is that a train?" Rosie's eyes were wide with wonder, all the anxiety of their situation forgotten in the face of something so unexpected. "Yes, baby, that's a train car." A pickup truck was already parked nearby, and a woman emerged as Evie pulled up beside it. She was probably in her late 70s, wearing jeans, boots, and a denim shirt that had faded to almost white. Her silver hair was pulled back in a long braid, and her face was weathered by what must have been decades of desert sun, but her eyes were sharp and assessing as she approached. "You must be Evelyn. I'm Margaret." She extended a calloused hand, and Evie shook it, feeling the strength still there despite the woman's age. "This is my daughter, Rosie." Margaret smiled at the little girl, and Evie saw genuine warmth there, not the pity she had been seeing in too many faces lately. "Well, Rosie, you want to see inside a real train car." Rosie nodded vigorously, all shyness forgotten. The door was on the side, and Margaret produced a ring of old brass keys from her pocket. "This thing belonged to my late husband, Harold. He bought it at an auction back in 1987, paid $800 for it, thought he was going to restore it, turn it into some kind of guest house or studio." She paused, looking at the train car with an expression Evie could not quite read. "That was 38 years ago. He never did." The door protested as Margaret opened it, hinges screaming from decades of disuse. The smell hit Evie first, musty and thick like old books and forgotten time, but underneath that was something else, the scent of aged wood and metal of history preserved in isolation. Evie stepped inside, and her breath caught. The interior was extraordinary. 2 rows of bench seats lined both walls, their burgundy leather cracked but still intact, still holding the shape of countless passengers from another era. The ceiling was curved and paneled with dark wood that had somehow survived without rotting, the grains still visible under layers of dust. At the far end was a small area that looked like it might have been a porter's station, with built-in cabinets and a tiny counter space. Afternoon light streamed through the grimy windows, catching dust motes and casting everything in a golden glow that made the whole space feel suspended in time. Despite the decay, Evie could see what this place had been, a luxury passenger car from the golden age of rail travel, when train journeys were not just transportation, but experiences, adventures, statements of style and comfort. "It's got history, this one." Margaret's voice came from behind her. "Harold researched it. This was part of the City of Los Angeles route, ran between Chicago and LA in the 30s and 40s. Carried movie stars, businessmen, families heading west to start new lives." Evie walked slowly down the center aisle, running her hand along the seats. Rosie had already climbed onto one of the benches, bouncing slightly and giggling more carefree than Evie had seen her in months. "Structure's solid." Margaret continued walking through with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years maintaining property in harsh conditions. "Harold reinforced the undercarriage before he lost interest. There's a water hookup. He ran a line from the well on the property. Electricity too, though I can't vouch for the wiring being up to any kind of code." She pointed to a small wood stove near the porter's area. "Harold installed that, said it would keep the place warm in winter. Nevada nights get cold even in the desert." "What about the land?" Evie heard herself asking, her practical nurse's mind already calculating possibilities and problems. "If I buy the train car, what happens to it sitting here?" Margaret crossed her arms, studying Evie with those sharp eyes that seemed to see right through whatever facade she was trying to maintain. "You planning to live in it?" There was no point in lying, and Evie was too tired for games anyway. "Yes. My daughter and I are being evicted. I need something I can afford, and this is all I can afford." Margaret's expression softened in a way that made Evie's throat tighten with unshed tears. "Thought it might be something like that. The only folks who look at this ad seriously are the desperate ones." She walked to one of the windows, looking out at the desert valley stretching toward distant mountains. "This land's mine, 20 acres. My kids want me to sell it, move into some retirement home in Reno, but I'm not ready for that yet." Margaret turned back to Evie with a decision clearly made. "Tell you what, you buy the train car for $500 and you can keep it here. I'll charge you $50 a month for the land rental. That includes water and electricity. You can stay as long as you need to, as long as I own this property." Evie's throat went completely tight. $50 a month. She spent more than that on gas each week just getting to and from work. Are you serious? Margaret's expression was steady, unflinching. Do I look like I'm joking? Besides, Harold would have liked knowing someone was actually using this thing, making it a home, instead of letting it rot into the desert. Evie turned to Rosie, who was now pretending to be a train conductor making choo-choo sounds and waving at imaginary passengers through the dusty windows. Her daughter looked happier than she had been in months, free and joyful in a way their cramped, stressed apartment had stopped allowing. The words came out before Evie could second-guess herself. I'll take it. Margaret smiled, the lines deepening around her eyes. Good. Got the title in my truck. We can do the paperwork right now if you want. 30 minutes later, Evie held a handwritten bill of sale and a key ring with 3 brass keys. She had just spent $500, nearly every cent she had, on an abandoned train car in the middle of the Nevada desert. It was the craziest thing she had ever done, and somehow it felt like the first right decision she had made in years. As Margaret drove away in her pickup, promising to return the next day to show Evie how the water and electrical systems worked, Evie and Rosie stood beside their new home. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, the train car casting a long shadow across the dusty ground. Mama, Rosie slipped her hand into Evie's. Is this really ours? Like we can really live here? Evie squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but maybe the possibility of hope. Yes, baby, this is really ours. Rosie's face lit up with pure delight. It's like the Boxcar Children. We're going to have the best adventure ever. That night they slept in the train car for the first time. Evie had brought sleeping bags from the car, and they spread them out on 2 of the bench seats. The wood stove actually worked, and Evie got a small fire going that pushed back the desert cold creeping in through the broken windows. Through those same windows she could see more stars than she had ever seen in her life. The sky an infinite canvas of light, unmarred by city pollution or suburban glow. Rosie fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's excitement and the novelty of their strange new home. But Evie lay awake for hours, her mind racing through everything she would have to do. Clean the entire car from top to bottom, replace the broken windows, or at least cover them properly. Figure out how to make the water and electricity work reliably. Find work nearby. Enroll Rosie in the local elementary school. Get through the first month with $47 and whatever she could scrape together. The list felt overwhelming, but for the first time in months, it did not feel impossible. It felt like a plan, a future, a chance. As she finally began to drift off to sleep, Evie's hand brushed against something on the wall beside her bench seat. In the darkness, she could barely make it out, but it felt like carved letters or numbers worn smooth by decades of hands touching the same spot. She made a mental note to look at it in the morning light, probably just old graffiti names of passengers' long-dead dates that meant nothing anymore. For now, sleep was calling, and tomorrow would bring enough challenges without worrying about mysterious carvings in old train cars. What Evie did not know, what she could not have known as she drifted into exhausted slumber, was that the marking she touched was a notation carefully carved by someone who had hidden something precious in this train car, 87 years ago, something that had waited through decades of silence for exactly the right person to find it. Someone desperate enough, brave enough to claim this unlikely sanctuary. The first week in the train car was harder than Evie had imagined, and her imagination had been pretty grim to begin with. The reality of living in an 87-year-old passenger car in the Nevada desert was vastly different from the romantic notions Rosie had embraced. There was no running water in any traditional sense. Margaret showed Evie how to use the hand pump connected to the well, and Evie spent her first 3 days hauling buckets back and forth for drinking, cooking, and washing, her back aching and shoulders burning. The electricity worked barely enough to power a small lamp and charge their phones, but not much else. The bathroom situation was perhaps the most challenging adjustment. Margaret had lent them a portable camping toilet and shown Evie where the outhouse was, a rough wooden structure about 50 yards from the train car. For a 6-year-old used to flush toilets and running water, this was a difficult reality to accept. "Mama, I don't like the potty outside." Rosie's voice was small and unhappy on their third morning. "It smells bad and it's dark." "I know, baby." Evie was scrubbing the built-in cabinets with borrowed cleaning supplies, her back already aching. "But we'll get used to it. It's an adventure, remember." But Rosie's enthusiasm was waning fast. She missed her friends, her old school, even the cramped apartment that, despite its problems, had been familiar and comfortable. Evie could see the realization setting in her daughter's eyes. This was not a fun camping trip, this was their new reality indefinitely. During those first days, Evie threw herself into making the train car livable with an intensity that bordered on manic. She scrubbed every surface, removing layers of dust and grime until her hands were raw. She duct-taped plastic sheeting over the broken windows to keep out the cold desert nights. She organized their few belongings into the built-in cabinets and storage areas, creating a sense of order in the chaos. The train car began to look less like an abandoned relic and more like a quirky, unconventional home. Evie hung sheets as room dividers, creating a small private sleeping area for Rosie near the rear of the car and a separate space for herself near the middle. She arranged Rosie's toys on one of the bench seats, creating a designated play area. She set up the small camping stove Margaret had lent them in the porter's area for cooking. Slowly, painstakingly, the train car was becoming theirs. On the fourth day, Margaret returned with her pickup truck loaded with supplies: old blankets that smelled of cedar, a kerosene heater, canned goods, a small electric hot plate, and even some fabric for curtains. "Figured you could use these." Margaret's voice was gruff as she helped Evie unload. "Had most of it sitting in my barn anyway, collecting dust." "You don't have to do this," Evie protested, even as tears sprang to her eyes from the simple kindness. "You've already been so generous." Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "Ain't charity, girl. It's neighborly. Besides," she looked around the train car, noting Evie's cleaning efforts with approval, "Harold would have been pleased to see someone bringing this place back to life. Been too long since these walls heard laughter." As they worked together hanging the curtains, Margaret shared more about her late husband. Harold was obsessed with this train car the last year of his life. Kept saying someone was coming for it, someone specific. "I thought grief was making him confused, but now—" She trailed off, looking at Evie with an expression that held something like wonder. "Now I think maybe he knew something I didn't." Margaret asked about work, and Evie explained she had a phone interview scheduled for the next day with Carson City Hospital for a nurse's aide position, the same kind of work she had done in California. "Good hospital." Margaret nodded. "My daughter Sarah works there, actually, in administration. I'll put in a word for you." True to her promise, Margaret did. 2 days later, Evie got the job. The pay was less than what she had been making in California, but so was the cost of living, especially now that their housing cost was just $50 a month. She would start in 2 weeks, giving her time to enroll Rosie in the local elementary school and settle into their new life as much as possible. But it was during that settling-in period, on a bright Saturday morning, 11 days after they had moved in, that Evie's curiosity about the carved markings finally overcame her exhaustion. Rosie was outside playing in the sagebrush under Margaret's supervision. The older woman had stopped by with fresh eggs and offered to watch the little girl for a few hours, so Evie could deep clean without interruption. Evie had moved all the portable items out of the porter's area, and was scrubbing the built-in counter when her nurse's eye for detail noticed something odd. The counter had a small cabinet beneath it, but when she measured with her hand, the interior dimensions of the cabinet did not match the exterior. The cabinet was about 8 inches deep on the inside, but the counter itself was at least 14 inches thick. She knocked on the back wall of the cabinet, her heart beginning to race. The sound was hollow, unmistakably so. Evie examined the cabinet more carefully, running her fingers along all the seams and joints with the methodical attention she had learned from years of checking patients for injuries and irregularities. On the left side near the floor she found a tiny brass button so tarnished and flush with the wood that it was nearly invisible. You would have to be looking for it to find it or stumble across it by accident the way she just had. She pressed the button. Nothing happened. Pressed harder. Still nothing. Then, remembering a puzzle box her grandfather had owned when she was young, she tried something different. She pressed and held the button while pulling gently on the back wall of the cabinet. The wall swung forward on hidden hinges with a soft click. Evie's breath stopped completely. The hidden space was perhaps 6 inches deep and ran the full width of the counter. Inside, covered in decades of dust that rose in a small cloud, were several items wrapped in oilcloth. With trembling hands that suddenly felt disconnected from her body, Evie reached in and carefully extracted the first bundle. The oilcloth crackled as she unwrapped it, the sound impossibly loud in the silent train car. Inside was a leather portfolio embossed with gold lettering that read Union Pacific Railway Employee Records. Evie opened it carefully, half expecting it to crumble in her hands, but the leather held. Inside were documents, personnel files, employment records from the 1930s, but these were not ordinary administrative papers. As Evie read through them, her eyes widening with each page, she began to understand what she had found. The documents detailed a theft, a massive, systematic theft of gold bullion that had been transported on Union Pacific trains between 1936 and 1938. According to the meticulously kept records, someone high up in the company had been stealing small amounts of gold from official shipments, amounts small enough that they would not be immediately noticed but would add up to a fortune over time. The documents included shipping manifests with discrepancies highlighted in faded pencil, internal memos expressing concern about the losses, and most damning of all, a ledger in someone's neat, careful handwriting detailing every single theft with names, dates, amounts, and locations where the stolen gold was being hidden. Evie set the portfolio aside with shaking hands and reached for the second bundle. This one contained photographs. Black and white images showing this very train car when it was new and gleaming, the paint fresh and bright, the brass fixtures shining in sunlight that had fallen 87 years ago. In several photos, a black man in a porter's uniform stood proudly beside the car. He was perhaps in his 40s with kind eyes and a gentle smile that reached across the decades. On the back of one photo, someone had written in that same neat handwriting, Thomas Whitfield, Chief Porter, City of Los Angeles Line, 1936. The third bundle made Evie's hands shake so badly she almost dropped it. It was a letter written in the same careful script as the ledger, and as she read it, tears began streaming down her face. The letter began, "To whoever finds this." It was dated April 17th, 1938. The man who had written it, Thomas Whitfield, the porter in the photographs, explained everything. He had discovered a regional manager named Robert Caldwell's systematic theft of gold. He had reported it to company leadership, believing they would investigate. Instead, Caldwell had accused Thomas of the theft. As a black man with no social standing against a wealthy white executive, Thomas knew he would not receive justice through official channels. So he had gathered evidence, documented everything, planning to take it to federal authorities. But Caldwell had learned of his intentions and threatened his life, threatened his family, his wife Grace, and his 5-year-old daughter Rose. Thomas had hidden the evidence in this train car, hoping that someday someone would find it and ensure the truth was told. The letter ended with a plea. If you are reading this, I am likely dead. Please take this evidence to the authorities. Make sure Thomas Whitfield's name is cleared and Robert Caldwell faces consequences for his crimes. Tell my Rose that her father loved her. Evie sat back against the counter, her vision blurred with tears. The letter was dated 87 years ago. Whatever had happened to Thomas Whitfield, it had happened long before she was born. But the evidence was here, physical proof of a crime and of one man's courage in exposing it. She reached for the fourth and final bundle with a sense that everything was about to change again. This bundle was heavier than the others. When she unwrapped the oilcloth, she gasped. Inside was a small wooden box about the size of a hardcover book. The wood was dark and polished, despite its age, inlaid with mother-of-pearl in an intricate geometric pattern that must have taken someone hours to create. There was a tiny brass lock on the front. Evie examined it, then searched the hidden compartment with methodical care. In the upper right corner, pressed into a tiny notch she would have missed if she had not been looking, she found a small brass key nearly black with tarnish. The key fit the lock perfectly. When Evie opened the box, she found a small notebook lying on top. Beneath it, wrapped in soft cloth that had somehow resisted decay, something glinted gold even in the dim light filtering through the train car's dusty windows. Gold coins! The box was filled with gold coins. Evie counted them with shaking hands, barely able to breathe. 25 coins each, marked with dates and denominations. American gold eagles from 1936 and 1937. Each coin was 1 ounce of pure gold. At current gold prices, which Evie knew from news reports she had heard at the hospital, was around $2,000 per ounce, these 25 coins were worth approximately $50,000. But it was the notebook that made Evie's breath stop completely and her heart slam against her ribs hard enough to hurt. Inside, in Thomas Whitfield's neat handwriting, was a list, a complete inventory of where Robert Caldwell had hidden the stolen gold, multiple locations throughout Nevada and California, listed with meticulous detail: train stations, warehouses, private properties, each with specific addresses or descriptions. One entry, circled and starred and underlined multiple times, read, "Primary cache, 847 ounces property near Carson City, Nevada," followed by precise coordinates, then buried 6 feet deep, marked by 3 stones in triangle formation. Evie grabbed her phone with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. She pulled up the map application and entered the coordinates with fumbling fingers. The pin dropped on the screen and Evie's vision went white at the edges. The location was less than half a mile from where she sat on property directly bordering Margaret's land. Thomas Whitfield had not just hidden evidence of the theft, he had found where Robert Caldwell had hidden the largest cache of stolen gold, and he had left a map to it. 847 ounces of gold at $2,000 per ounce. That was nearly $1.7 million. Evie collapsed to her knees on the floor of the train car, surrounded by documents and gold coins and evidence of a crime committed before her mother was born. She had bought a $500 train car to keep her daughter from being homeless. Instead, she had stumbled onto a fortune that had been waiting 87 years for someone to find it. But more than the gold, she had found Thomas Whitfield's story, a man who had tried to do the right thing and had almost certainly paid for it with his life, because there was no doubt in Evie's mind, sitting there on that dusty floor with tears streaming down her face, that Robert Caldwell had killed him. The evidence would have destroyed Caldwell, so he had eliminated the threat, and then he had never retrieved his stolen gold because he could not. Perhaps he had been arrested for something else. Perhaps he died. Perhaps the locations had become inaccessible. Whatever the reason, the gold had stayed buried all these decades until now, until a desperate single mother had bought an abandoned train car and found the secret hidden in its walls. Evie's first instinct was to grab Rosie, drive to those coordinates, and start digging. But she forced herself to stop and think, to use the practical problem-solving skills that nursing had taught her. This was bigger than just treasure hunting. This was historical evidence. This was proof of a crime and of Thomas Whitfield's courage in exposing it, even knowing it would likely cost him everything. She needed help. She needed someone she could trust. Margaret. Margaret would know what to do. Evie carefully rewrapped everything except the letter and the small wooden box with the gold coins. She took photos of every document with her phone, backing them up to the cloud with hands that were still shaking. Then she hid everything back in the secret compartment, pressing the brass button to watch the hidden panel swing closed with a soft click that seemed final and absolute. She walked outside on legs that felt unsteady. Margaret was sitting in a folding chair she had brought from her truck, watching Rosie chase a lizard through the sagebrush with the patient smile of someone who remembered what childhood wonder looked like. "Margaret." Evie's voice came out strange, higher than normal. "I need to show you something. Something I found in the train car." The older woman studied Evie's face with those sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. "You look like you've seen a ghost, girl. What did you find?" Evie took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of 87 years pressing down on her shoulders. Not a ghost, a treasure, and a story that needs to be told. Inside the train car, Evie showed Margaret everything. The leather portfolio spread across the bench seats, Thomas Whitfield's letter held carefully between them, the photographs of a man whose smile reached across nearly 90 years, and finally, the wooden box with its 25 gold coins that caught the light filtering through plastic-covered windows. Margaret read through the documents twice, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she finished, she removed her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, a gesture that spoke of decades spent making difficult decisions on this unforgiving land. "Evelyn, do you understand what you have here? Evidence of a crime from 1938, and a map to stolen gold." Margaret's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen enough of the world to know its darker corners. "It's more than that. This is a piece of American history. Thomas Whitfield was a black man in the 1930s who tried to fight corruption and was almost certainly killed for it. His story deserves to be told properly. He deserves justice even 87 years late." "But what about the gold?" Evie's question came out smaller than she had intended, thinking of Rosie outside of hospital bills yet to come, of a future that had seemed so uncertain just hours ago. "The gold, if it's really there and can be legally recovered, could be yours. But we need to do this the right way." Margaret leaned forward, her tone shifting into what Evie suspected was the voice she had used running a ranch for 5 decades. "We need historians, law enforcement, an attorney who specializes in treasure trove law. The last thing you want is to dig up treasure and lose it to legal challenges because you didn't follow proper procedure. How long will that take? Could be months, could be years. But if we do it right, you'll keep what's rightfully yours, and Thomas Whitfield's story will be told the way it should be." Margaret stood walking to the window, her silhouette framed against the desert light. When she turned back, her eyes held something Evie had not seen before, a kind of recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle decades in the making were finally clicking into place. "Harold knew." The words came out quiet but certain. "My husband spent 30 years looking for something in this train car. 30 years, Evelyn. From the day he bought it in 87 until the day he died in 2017. Evie felt the air in the train car change, becoming heavier, with the weight of connections spanning generations. Margaret continued, her voice taking on the quality of someone sharing a secret kept too long. "Harold worked for Union Pacific in the 50s after he came back from Korea. He heard stories about Thomas Whitfield, a porter who disappeared in 38. Everyone said the man stole gold and ran, but Harold never believed it. He researched for 40 years, tracked down old records, interviewed retired railway workers who remembered the case. She picked up one of the photographs, studying Thomas Whitfield's face with something like reverence. When this train car came up for auction in '87, Harold drove all night to get there. Paid $800. We didn't really have, because he was convinced the evidence was hidden somewhere inside. He looked everywhere, tapped every wall, examined every joint, but he never found it. Margaret set the photo down gently, and her next words carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. The last year of his life, Harold kept saying someone was coming for it, someone specific. I thought the cancer medication was making him confused, but now I understand. He was right. You were supposed to find this, Evelyn. Not me, not Harold, you. Sometimes the universe waits for exactly the right person to arrive at exactly the right moment. The words hung in the air between them, and Evie felt something shift in her understanding of the past 11 days. This had not been random chance or desperate luck. This had been something else, a convergence of need and purpose that she was only beginning to comprehend. "There's someone who can help," Margaret said, pulling her phone from her pocket. "Bennett Hayes. He was Harold's apprentice, learned everything about railway restoration from him. More importantly, he's honest, and he understands what this train car represents." The call was brief. Margaret explained that she had sold Harold's train car, and the new owner had found something historical inside. The man's voice on speaker was deep and measured, carrying the controlled cadence of someone trained to stay calm in chaos. "I'll come tomorrow morning." After Margaret left with promises to return, Evie went outside to where Rosie was building a fort from sagebrush branches, her small hands already scratched from the rough wood, but her face alight with the kind of joy that came from creating something out of nothing. "Mama, look what I made." Evie knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close. "It's beautiful, baby. Can we stay here forever?" The question carried more weight than a 6-year-old could possibly understand, more layers than Evie knew how to explain. They sat together as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in colors that seemed impossible, crimson and gold and purple bleeding together in ways that made the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. That night, after Rosie was asleep, Evie sat at the small fold-out table she had set up near the porter's area, reading Thomas Whitfield's letter again by lamplight. She had been a nurse long enough to recognize the handwriting of someone writing under extreme stress, the slight tremor in the lines, the places where the pen had pressed too hard, leaving indentations in the paper beneath. She read the final lines again. "Tell my Rose that her father loved her more than life itself. Tell Grace I'm sorry. Tell anyone who listens that Thomas Whitfield was not a thief. I was just a man who couldn't look away from evil." Evie folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the oilcloth. Outside, the desert night was vast and silent, filled with stars that had witnessed everything: the theft, the murder, the decades of silence, and now this moment of rediscovery. Somewhere out there, less than half a mile away, gold waited in the ground. But what mattered more was the truth waiting to be told. Bennett Hayes arrived at 9 the next morning in a Ford F-150 that had clearly seen decades of work, but was maintained with the kind of care that spoke of respect for tools and craft. He was 52, according to Margaret's brief description, but Evie thought he looked both younger and older depending on how the light caught his face. Salt and pepper hair, lean build, and a way of moving that suggested military training, economical, purposeful, always aware of his surroundings. He wore work clothes faded from actual labor rather than fashion, and carried a professional toolbox that had seen decades of use. When he approached, Rosie peeked from behind Evie's legs, shy in the presence of a stranger. Bennett knelt to her level without being asked, his movements careful and unthreatening. "You must be Rosie. This is your train car." "Me and Mama's." The little girl's voice was barely audible. "That's wonderful. Train cars need families who love them." His smile transformed his weathered face, entirely erasing the lines and revealing something gentler underneath. Over coffee that Evie made on the camping stove, Bennett explained his background. 20 years in the Marines, deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan that he mentioned only in passing, the way veterans often did when the memories were still too sharp to examine directly. Then a second career in historical restoration after his wife Laura died 3 years ago from a cancer that had taken her in 6 brutal months. No children, just me and my work preserving pieces of history that would otherwise crumble into dust. Harold Ashford was my mentor. Bennett's voice carried genuine affection, the kind reserved for people who had fundamentally shaped who you became. Met him when I was 19, fresh out of boot camp and stationed at Fallon. I'd hang around old trains on weekends, and Harold found me one day, taught me everything about restoration. He walked through the train car with the careful attention of someone reading a language only he could fully understand. His hands traced the wood panels, the brass fixtures hidden under tarnish, the way the frame bore its weight after nearly 90 years of desert weather. 1938 Union Pacific, City of Los Angeles line, one of the finest passenger cars ever built. He pointed out details Evie had missed, the hand-carved scrollwork barely visible under decades of grime, the weight distribution that suggested regular transport of something heavy, the craftsmanship that spoke of an era when beauty mattered as much as function. When Evie showed him the hidden compartment and demonstrated the brass button and the panel that swung open on concealed hinges, Bennett went completely still. His hand hovered over the opening without touching, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was trying to contain. Harold knew. He knew, and he spent years trying to find it. You knew Harold was looking for something. Bennett turned to face her, and Evie saw tears forming in his eyes. Before he died, he told me this train car had secrets. Said the right person would find them when the time was right. He paused, studying Evie with an intensity that made her feel like he was seeing past her surface to something deeper. I think he meant you. Evie brought out the leather portfolio, and Bennett examined the embossing with careful fingers, the reverence of someone who understood the weight of history held in fragile materials. When he opened it and saw the first documents detailing Robert Caldwell's theft, the color drained from his face so completely that Evie reached out instinctively to steady him. Robert Caldwell. The name came out like something poisonous. Everyone in Nevada railway history knows that name. He was a legend, died in '52, wealthy and honored. He was a thief and a murderer. Evie's voice was steady despite her racing heart. The photographs came next, and when Bennett saw Thomas Whitfield's face staring back from 87 years ago, his hands began to shake. He pulled out his own wallet with movements that seemed disconnected from conscious thought, extracted a photograph worn soft at the edges, and held it beside Evie's. The same man, unmistakably. Thomas Whitfield in his porter's uniform, perhaps a year or two younger in Bennett's photo, but definitely the same person. How do you have his picture? Evie's question felt like it was coming from very far away. Bennett's voice broke on the words. Because he was my grandfather. My full name is Bennett Thomas Hayes. My mother's maiden name was Whitfield. Her father was Thomas Whitfield. He disappeared in 1938 when she was 5 years old. The silence in the train car was absolute, except for the desert wind moving through gaps in the windows, carrying with it the scent of sage and secrets finally coming to light. My mother died 10 years ago in 2015. Bennett continued, tears streaming down his face unchecked. She spent her entire life believing her father had abandoned her, believed he'd stolen gold and run away. Rose Whitfield Hayes died believing her father was a thief and a coward. Evie handed him Thomas's letter with shaking hands. You should read this." Bennett read slowly, his breathing growing more ragged with each line. When he reached the part about Rose, my 5-year-old daughter, his hands trembled so badly that Evie gently took the letter back and finished reading aloud, her own voice breaking on the final words. "Tell my Rose that her father loved her more than life itself." When she finished, Bennett was sitting on the floor, head in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken, a place where grief had lived for 87 years, waiting for this moment of release. Margaret, who had arrived quietly during the reading, moved to sit beside him, her weathered hand on his back, offering the kind of comfort that needed no words. Rosie, who had been watching quietly from her play area, walked over and put her small hand on Bennett's shoulder. "Mr. Bennett, don't cry. We found your grandpa." She spoke with the absolute certainty of childhood, the kind of faith that saw the world in simple truths. "He's not lost anymore. We found his truth." Bennett looked up at her through tears and pulled her into a hug, this child he had just met offering comfort he had not known he needed. "Yes, sweetheart, you and your mama found him." He turned to Evie, his face transformed by grief and gratitude, and something that looked like hope emerging from long darkness. "Thank you. Thank you for caring about a stranger's story." Over the next 3 days, more people arrived. Detective Isaiah Grant from Nevada State Police, 45, African-American, with the kind of sharp intelligence in his eyes that missed nothing. He specialized in heritage crimes and cold cases, motivated by his own grandfather's stories of working as a Pullman porter in an era when that meant being invisible to the white passengers you served. Grant brought forensics experts who photographed every document, tested paper fibers and ink composition, authenticated handwriting against Union Pacific employment records they accessed from historical archives. Everything checked out. The documents were genuine 1938 materials. The handwriting was definitely Thomas Whitfield's, matching samples from his employment file, and the ledger's details matched shipping manifests that Union Pacific had kept but never fully investigated. Thomas Whitfield was reported missing May 20th, 1938. Grant delivered this information standing in the train car where Thomas had hidden his final hope for justice. His wife Grace filed a missing person report. She told police her husband would never abandon them. They told her he was wanted for theft and had fled. She insisted he was innocent. They closed the case. Robert Caldwell's history painted a picture of respectability built on theft and murder. Regional manager of precious metals transport, died 1952 at age 72. Left an estate worth $2.3 million. In 1952, money donated to churches and schools had buildings named after him, was eulogized as a pillar of the Carson City community. Grant's voice carried decades of understanding how injustice worked. Pillars of the community are the last people anyone suspects. The perfect cover. 3 days into the investigation, Preston Caldwell learned what was happening. He was 42 years old, Robert Caldwell's great-grandson, CEO of Caldwell Industries, with operations across Nevada and California, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through the application of money and influence. The first Evie heard of him was an article in the Carson City Chronicle with the headline, "State Police Reopen, 1938, Case Accusations Against Respected Businessman." Preston was quoted extensively, his words carefully chosen by someone who understood the power of public perception. Robert Caldwell was a pillar of this community. These baseless accusations are an insult to his memory and our family's legacy. We will fight this slander with every resource at our disposal. The article mentioned Evie by name as the new train car owner who had found the evidence. Her phone rang that afternoon while she was organizing Rosie's school supplies for her first day at the local elementary. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway. "Miss Blackwood?" The voice was smooth, confident, the kind of voice used to getting what it wanted. "Preston Caldwell, I'd like to discuss this matter privately." "I have nothing to discuss with you. I understand you're facing financial difficulties. I'm prepared to offer you $150,000 for any documents you found. Cash, no questions. You walk away, forget this ever happened." Evie's grip tightened on the phone. "Those documents prove your great-grandfather was a thief and a murderer." The smoothness vanished from his voice, replaced by something cold and sharp. "Careful, Miss Blackwood. Accusing a deceased man of crimes based on supposed evidence, that's defamation. My attorneys are already preparing legal action." Evie ended the call with hands that wanted to shake but would not let themselves. She told Bennett that evening, and his response was immediate and protective in a way that made something warm unfold in her chest. "Preston Caldwell is dangerous, politically connected, used to getting his way. His presence here needs to be taken seriously." Bennett's presence at the train car had become constant over the past week. He camped in his truck at night, worked on restoration plans during the day, teaching Rosie about trains and wood grain and the satisfaction of fixing broken things. Evie had tried to protest his staying, but Bennett had been firm in a way that brooked no argument. "My grandfather died trying to protect his family. I won't let anyone threaten his granddaughter's family." The way he said it, the weight behind the words, made it clear this was not up for debate. Rosie had taken to calling him Uncle Bennett with the easy affection of a child starved for positive male attention. Evie watched them together, Bennett showing Rosie how to identify different types of wood, Bennett reading her bedtime stories, Bennett making her laugh, and felt something shift in her chest that she thought had died when David left. But the threats continued. A well-dressed man approached Evie in the hospital break room on her second day of work. Professional suit, expensive briefcase, the kind of polish that came from money and practice. "Miss Blackwood, I represent a client interested in historical artifacts. My client would like to purchase any maps or documents you found. $250,000. "Not interested." "It's a very generous offer." "Those documents aren't for sale. They're evidence." The man's expression hardened just slightly, a crack in the professional veneer. "My client is prepared to go higher, $500,000. Evie stood her nurse's training, keeping her voice level despite her racing pulse. "Tell your client to leave me alone." The man gathered his briefcase with deliberate slowness. "You're making powerful enemies, Miss Blackwood. Think about your daughter." That night, Evie found Bennett installing motion sensors around the property, perimeter cameras at every angle, an alarm system connected to his phone in Grant's office. State police increased patrols, a trooper driving by every 2 hours, but the surveillance continued. A black van appeared on a distant hill with a clear view of the train car. No license plates visible. It sat there for hours, then drove away when Evie looked directly at it through binoculars Margaret had lent her. The van returned the next day, and the day after that, watching, waiting. Grant ran the description through his databases. "Could be Victor Kane's crew. He's active in Nevada. If it's him, this is serious. He's not just a thief, Evie. He's dangerous." But something else was happening, too. Something that had nothing to do with threats or surveillance. The train car was transforming under Bennett's guidance, and with it something in Evie was transforming as well. Bennett taught her how to sand wood properly, how to feel for the grain, how to apply pressure evenly so the surface became smooth as glass. He showed her how to mix compounds to fill cracks in the old leather seats, how to clean brass without damaging the patina that gave it character, how to repair broken joints in the wooden panels. "Every piece you fix," Bennett explained one afternoon while they worked side by side. "You're not just restoring the train car, you're restoring yourself." His words settled into something deeper than instruction. "Trauma leaves marks just like time leaves marks on wood. You can't erase them, but you can repair them, make them part of the story instead of the whole story. That's what restoration really is, taking something broken and giving it new purpose. The words settled into Evie like seeds finding soil. She had been so focused on survival, on keeping Rosie safe, on making it through each day, that she had not realized how broken she felt inside, how much damage David's abandonment and the months of struggle had done. But here, with her hands on wood that had survived 87 years, with Bennett patient beside her, with Rosie playing nearby in the lengthening shadows, Evie felt something beginning to heal. Each stroke of sandpaper was meditation. Each repaired joint was proof that broken things could be made whole again. Each day the train car looked more like a home and less like a refuge, and with it Evie felt more like herself and less like someone just trying to survive. Margaret visited almost daily, bringing food supplies and the kind of steady presence that came from someone who had weathered every storm the desert could throw and remained standing. She sat with Evie in the evenings after Rosie was asleep, drinking coffee and talking about Harold, about the ranch, about what it meant to find purpose in unexpected places. "Harold used to say that some things wait," Margaret said one night, her voice soft in the lamplight. "He said this train car was waiting, that it had a purpose it hadn't fulfilled yet. I think he was right. It was waiting for you, Evie, not for the gold, for you." 2 weeks after the discovery, Preston Caldwell filed for an injunction requesting that any excavation be blocked pending a full legal review. His attorneys argued that Robert Caldwell's reputation was being unfairly damaged, that evidence needed independent verification, and that any gold found would constitute family property stolen from Robert decades ago. The injunction hearing was scheduled for the following week. Bennett helped Evie find an attorney, someone Margaret recommended, a woman named Victoria Chen, who had spent 20 years as a prosecutor before moving into private practice, specializing in property and treasure trove law. Victoria was 58, sharp-eyed and sharper-minded, the kind of lawyer who saw through bullshit with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She reviewed all the evidence, interviewed Bennett and Grant, studied the forensic reports, and then met with Evie in the train car that had become the center of everything. "Good news is you documented everything correctly. Bad news is they're escalating. Someone really wants that map, and they're willing to pay serious money for it." "What do we do?" Victoria's smile was not comforting. "We prepare for war. Preston Caldwell has resources, but we have truth. And in a courtroom, truth still matters. Sometimes." The night before the hearing, Evie could not sleep. She lay in her sleeping bag, listening to Rosie's soft breathing, thinking about Thomas Whitfield and what he had risked, what he had lost. He had known that speaking truth to power might cost him everything, and he had done it anyway because some things mattered more than safety. Bennett was outside, sitting by the small fire he had built, keeping watch. Evie wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and joined him, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. They did not speak for a long time, just watched the flames dance and listened to the desert night. Finally, Bennett broke the silence. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you did the right thing. My grandfather would be grateful. I'm terrified." The admission came out before Evie could stop it. "So was he." Bennett's voice was gentle. "That letter, you could feel his fear in every word. But he did it anyway. Courage isn't not being afraid, Evie. It's being afraid and doing what's right regardless." Evie leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beating of his heart. "When did you get so wise?" "Harold taught me that too. Said wisdom was just pain turned into understanding." They sat together until the fire burned low, and when Evie finally returned to her sleeping bag, she felt ready. Not unafraid, but ready. Tomorrow they would face Preston Caldwell and his attorneys and his money and his power. Tomorrow they would stand for Thomas Whitfield, for truth, for the idea that justice could transcend decades and that one person's courage could ripple forward through time to touch lives not yet lived. The train car creaked softly in the night wind, settling into itself the way old things do, and Evie thought about all the passengers it had carried, all the journeys it had witnessed, and now this, its most important journey of all, carrying truth across 87 years of silence into the light. The Carson City Courthouse smelled of old wood and older secrets, the kind of building that had witnessed a century of human drama playing out in measured legal language. Evie sat at the plaintiff's table with Victoria beside her, conscious of every eye in the packed courtroom, every camera positioned to capture what the media had already dubbed the Porter's Gold Case. Preston Caldwell sat in the back row with three attorneys from a San Francisco firm, his expression confident and slightly bored, as if this were merely a formality before he got what he wanted. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Evie had made in 6 months at the hospital, his posture radiating the ease of someone who had never been told no and meant it. Behind Evie sat Bennett, Margaret, Grant, and Rosie, who had insisted on coming despite Evie's reservations. "I want to be there for Mr. Thomas," the little girl had declared with the fierce loyalty only children possess, and Evie had not had the heart to refuse. Judge Eleanor Hartman entered, and the courtroom rose. She was 68, African-American with close-cropped silver hair, and eyes that assessed everything with the precision of someone who had spent 3 decades on the bench learning to separate truth from performance. Her reputation preceded her, fair, intelligent, and utterly intolerant of legal maneuvering designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The hearing began with Preston's lead attorney, Marcus Webb, a man whose every gesture spoke of practiced theater. "Your Honor, my client's great-grandfather cannot defend himself against these accusations. We question the authenticity and motives behind this so-called evidence," he implied without quite stating that Evie had fabricated documents for profit, his tone dripping with skepticism about a desperate woman who had bought a train car and suddenly discovered a convenient treasure map. The performance was smooth rehearsed, designed to plant seeds of doubt about both the evidence and Evie's character. Victoria's response was methodical and devastating. She called Grant first, who testified about the complete forensic authentication paper, dating ink analysis, handwriting verification against Union Pacific employment records accessed from National Archives. The documents were genuine 1938 materials, no question, no room for doubt. She presented Thomas Whitfield's employment history meticulously documented, showing a man who had worked for Union Pacific for 12 years with exemplary service records. She showed the missing person report filed by Grace Whitfield on May 21, 1938, the day after her husband failed to return from what she believed was a trip to San Francisco. She showed the official declaration signed by Grant just 3 days earlier that Thomas Whitfield's disappearance was now ruled a homicide based on the evidence discovered and the historical context. The courtroom reacted with audible gasps and whispers that rippled through the gallery like wind through grass. Then Victoria called Bennett to the stand, and Evie watched him walk forward with the bearing of a man who had faced worse things than hostile attorneys, but understood this mattered in ways combat never had. Bennett stated his name, his relationship to the case, his credentials as a historical restoration expert. Webb stood with theatrical skepticism that made Evie's hands clench. "Mr. Hayes, isn't it convenient that a supposed grandson appears only after treasure is discovered?" Victoria was on her feet. "Your Honor, I have documentation." She presented Bennett's birth certificate listing Rose Whitfield Hayes as his mother, born June 3, 1933. Rose's birth certificate listing Thomas Whitfield as her father, married to Grace Whitfield. Family photographs spanning decades, letters that Rose had kept her entire life written in her mother's hand, speaking of a father who had vanished and left them with nothing but shame. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, a paper trail that stretched across 87 years, connecting this man in the witness stand to the porter in those faded photographs. Bennett's voice broke as he spoke, and he made no effort to hide it. My mother, Rose Whitfield Hayes, died in December 2015. She spent 82 years believing her father had abandoned her. Every time someone asked about her family, she carried the weight of that shame, the belief that her father had chosen gold over her, over my grandmother, over the life they had built. He pulled out the photograph he always carried, setting it on the witness stand where everyone could see. Thomas Whitfield, smiling in his porter's uniform, young and hopeful in a world that would kill him for doing the right thing. She kept this picture hidden in a drawer. She couldn't bear to look at it, but she couldn't throw it away either. That's what Robert Caldwell stole from my family. Not just my grandfather's life, but my mother's peace. Her ability to remember her father with anything but pain. Bennett looked directly at Preston Caldwell, and his voice carried the weight of 3 generations of grief finally given voice. Your Honor, I'm not here for money. I'm here for my grandfather's name. I'm here because the truth matters even 87 years later. I'm here because my mother deserved to die knowing her father was a hero, not a thief. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying, including several members of the jury pool seated in the gallery. Judge Hartman's expression remained neutral, but Evie saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. Evie's testimony came next, and Webb tried aggression as a tactic, his questions designed to portray her as an opportunist who would say anything for money. You were desperate when you bought that train car, correct? Yes. Facing eviction, nearly homeless? Yes. Isn't it possible you fabricated this story for profit, that you created these documents, planted them in that train car? Evie met his eyes without flinching, drawing on every ounce of strength she had built from years of nursing, of staying calm in emergencies, of knowing the difference between what was real and what was performance. Everything I found has been authenticated by Nevada State Police Forensics. The paper is from 1938. The ink is from 1938. The handwriting matches Thomas Whitfield's employment records. Unless you're suggesting I have access to a time machine, your theory is impossible. But you'll become wealthy from this, won't you? I hope so. Evie's voice was steady because she had learned something over the past weeks, had learned it from Thomas Whitfield's letter and Bennett's grief and Margaret's steady presence. Because Thomas Whitfield left that gold as payment for whoever would tell his story. He knew he was going to die. He knew Robert Caldwell would kill him, but he hid the evidence anyway, hoping someone would find it and care enough to seek justice. I'm honoring his wishes. If that makes me wealthy, then it's because a good man 87 years ago believed truth was worth dying for. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, charged with something Evie could not quite name, but felt in her bones. Judge Hartman reviewed all evidence overnight, the weight of history and justice balanced on her desk in chambers where she sat alone with documents that spoke of courage and murder, and the long, slow arc of truth finally bending toward light. The next morning the courtroom was even more packed. Standing room only, people pressed against the back walls, hoping to witness history being made. Evie held Rosie's hand perhaps too tightly, feeling the little girl's pulse rapid against her palm. Judge Hartman delivered her ruling with the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of seeing through lies and recognizing truth even when it arrived covered in dust and wrapped in oilcloth. This court finds sufficient evidence that Thomas Whitfield was murdered in the course of attempting to expose corporate theft. His evidence is credible, authenticated, and deserving of protection. Robert Caldwell's great-grandson's attempt to block excavation is denied. She looked directly at Preston Caldwell, and her voice carried steel wrapped in velvet. Mr. Caldwell, your great-grandfather's reputation is not being slandered. It is being accurately revealed through historical record. The man you believed was a pillar of the community was in fact a thief and very likely a murderer. That is not defamation. That is truth. Excavation may proceed under state archaeological oversight. Should gold be recovered, standard Nevada treasure trove law applies 70% to the finder, 30% to the property owner. Preston Caldwell's rage was visible even as he tried to control it, his face flushing red, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair hard enough that his knuckles went white. Outside the courthouse, he confronted Evie with media cameras rolling, capturing every word for the evening news. "You think you've won, this isn't over." Bennett stepped between them, his military bearing suddenly very apparent, the easygoing restoration expert replaced by someone who had fought in places where threats were followed by action. "Yes, it is. Walk away. My family built Nevada. You're nobody." Preston's voice carried the petulance of someone unused to losing. Evie's voice carried clearly captured by every microphone thrust toward her. "Your family stole from Nevada. Thomas Whitfield was somebody, and now everyone will know it." The excavation was scheduled for 5 days later, enough time for Dr. Helena Thornton to assemble her team for the proper permits to be secured for the media circus to reach full frenzy. Evie spent those days in a state of suspended reality, going through the motions of her shifts at the hospital, helping Rosie with homework, working with Bennett on the train car's restoration, all while feeling like she was watching herself from a distance. But on the third day, something happened that reminded Evie that victory was never guaranteed, that powerful people fought hardest when cornered. She arrived home from her shift to find Margaret waiting, her face drawn with worry. "Evie, I need to talk to you." Inside the train car, Margaret explained that her children had been contacted by lawyers representing Preston Caldwell. They were offering to buy the 20 acres for triple its market value cash, immediate closing. The condition Evie would have to leave would have 30 days to vacate. "My kids are pressuring me hard," Margaret admitted, her voice strained. "It's more money than they ever expected to inherit. They're saying I'm foolish to turn it down." Evie felt her world tilting again, the ground she thought had solidified beneath her feet turning to sand. "What are you going to tell them?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Evie felt the full weight of her precarious position. She owned a train car, but not the land beneath it. Everything could still be taken away. Finally, Margaret spoke, and her voice carried the steel that had kept her on this land through 5 decades of hardship. "I'm telling them Harold spent 30 years looking for something in this train car, and you found it. I'm telling them some things matter more than money. And I'm telling them this land stays in my name until I'm dead, and what happens then is their business. But right now, it's mine." The relief that flooded through Evie was so intense it felt like pain. "Margaret, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm deciding." Margaret's expression softened. "Besides, Harold would haunt me if I let Preston Caldwell win. Some battles are worth fighting, even when they cost you something." The morning of the excavation arrived with a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Media trucks had been assembling since dawn, their satellite dishes catching early sunlight like strange mechanical flowers blooming across the desert. Dr. Thornton directed her team of 5 specialists with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades unearthing history from reluctant Earth. Grant stood with 4 state troopers establishing a perimeter, while Victoria filmed everything on her phone for legal documentation. Evie held Rosie's hand, watching the crowd grow to over 200 locals drawn by news stories about an 87-year-old mystery finally being solved. Bennett stood close behind them, one hand resting on Evie's shoulder in a gesture that had become natural over the weeks, a silent promise that she was not alone in this, would never be alone in this again. The Henderson property stretched half a mile from the train car, abandoned ranch buildings collapsing slowly under decades of weather. but the sight itself was beautiful in its desolation. Desert valley mountain backdrop, wildflowers, somehow thriving in soil that looked like it could not support anything living. The coordinates Thomas Whitfield had written led them to a clearing near an ancient oak tree, gnarled and weathered, but still standing still, bearing witness. 3 stones marked a triangle exactly as Thomas had described, placed with care 87 years ago by hands that knew they were marking something that might never be found. Dr. Thornton's ground-penetrating radar confirmed what Evie had been afraid to fully believe until this moment. Large metallic object approximately 6 feet down, dimensions consistent with a strongbox or safe, roughly 3 feet by 2 feet by 1.5 feet. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause that rolled across the desert like thunder. Evie felt her knees weaken, felt Bennett's hand tighten on her shoulder, felt Rosie squeeze her fingers with excited strength. "Oh my God, it's real." The words came out as a whisper. Bennett's voice was thick with emotion only she could hear. "My grandfather never lied. He wasn't trying to hide anything. He was trying to expose everything." Doctor. Thornton addressed the crowd through a megaphone, her voice carrying authority and caution in equal measure. "This will take several hours. Archaeological protocol requires documenting every layer. We appreciate your patience. What's been buried 87 years can wait a few more hours to be revealed properly." The first shovel broke ground to applause and camera flashes that created a strobe effect in the bright morning. Rosie bounced on her toes, her earlier restlessness transformed into excitement she could barely contain. "How long, Mama?" "A while, baby. But after 87 years, a few more hours won't hurt." Evie paused, pulling her daughter close. "Mr. Thomas waited a long time for someone to find this. We can wait a little longer to honor him properly." The excavation progressed with methodical care that felt agonizing to watch. 1 foot down the soil, sandy and loose, easier to move, but requiring careful documentation of each layer. 2 feet darker and more compressed, the earth holding secrets the way earth always did, patient and silent. Dr. Thornton photographed every layer, her team working with trowels and brushes as they went deeper, treating this not just as treasure recovery, but as the archaeological site it truly was. The crowd settled into patient observation, some bringing folding chairs from their vehicles, others sitting directly on the desert ground, content to watch history unfold at whatever pace history demanded. 3 feet down, Dr. Thornton paused, examining the soil with the practiced eye of someone who could read stories in dirt and stone. Soil disturbance here is consistent with something buried approximately 80 to 90 years ago. The time frame matches exactly. Evie could not breathe properly, her chest tight with anticipation and fear and hope, all tangled together into something that felt like drowning on dry land. Bennett had moved to stand beside her rather than behind, and his hand found hers with a naturalness that made her realize how much had changed between them in just a few weeks, how foundations could be laid in crisis, how trust could grow in soil that seemed too harsh to support anything tender. 4 feet down, the team switched to even smaller tools, brushes, and dental picks, treating every inch of earth like it might contain something precious beyond gold. The crowd pressed closer despite the barriers, everyone straining to see, drawn by the human need to witness moments when the past breaks through into the present. At 5 feet, the metal detectors began beeping with increased intensity, a chorus of electronic chirps that made the hair on Evie's arms stand up. "We're close." "Doctor." Thornton's voice carried across the crowd, and the noise level rose, people unable to contain their excitement. Evie fell to her knees without meaning to, overwhelmed by the weight of this moment, by everything it represented. Rosie scrambled down beside her, small arms wrapping around her mother, and Bennett knelt on her other side, one arm around Evie, the other around Rosie. The 3 of them connected in this instant when time collapsed and 87 years became nothing, became a breath, became this. 6 feet down, The archaeologist's trowel struck metal with a sound that carried clear and definite like a bell being rung to mark the hour. "We have contact." The noise from the crowd was deafening cheers, screams, applause that lasted 5 full minutes, people embracing strangers, cameras flashing, helicopters overhead, recording everything for news broadcasts that would be watched by millions. Evie sobbed, the sound torn from somewhere deep, and Rosie held her tighter while Bennett whispered into her hair, "You did it. You honored him. My grandfather has justice." But Dr. Thornton had not finished. As the team carefully brushed soil away, revealing a large metal box, heavily corroded but structurally intact, she paused, her movements becoming more deliberate, more careful. She knelt closer, brushing with infinite patience at an area just beyond where the box lay, and her expression changed. "Stop! Everyone stop!" Her voice cut through the celebration, turning heads, silencing the crowd. "We have something else. We have human remains." Time stopped. The desert held its breath. Every sound ceased, as if the world had pressed pause on its own spinning. Dr. Thornton worked with her team for another 20 minutes, carefully exposing what the earth had hidden, a complete skeleton buried at the same depth as the box, positioned as if the person had been lying beside it when they died. The skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, a crack along the temporal bone that spoke of violence, of murder, of a life ended with brutal efficiency. Bennett made a sound Evie had never heard from him before, something between a sob and a prayer, his body shaking as he stared at the bones of his grandfather finally found after 87 years. "Thomas Whitfield. He's been here the whole time, guarding his truth." Dr. Thornton turned to face the crowd, her expression grave with the weight of what they had uncovered. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is now officially a murder scene as well as an archaeological excavation. The remains will be treated with the utmost respect. Based on location dating and trauma evidence, I believe we have found Thomas Whitfield." Grant stepped forward, his voice carrying the formal weight of law enforcement making official declarations. "This confirms what we suspected. Thomas Whitfield was murdered likely on May 15, 1938, and buried here with the evidence he tried to bring to light. Robert Caldwell or his associates killed him to silence him." The crowd's reaction was different now. Subdued, respectful. The celebration tempered by the reminder that this was not just about gold, but about a man who had died for trying to do what was right. People removed hats, bowed heads, and in the silence that followed, Evie heard Rosie's small voice. "Can we say a prayer for Mr. Thomas?" It was Margaret who stepped forward, her voice strong despite her age, carrying across the desert with the authority of someone who had presided over births and deaths and everything between for 7 decades on this unforgiving land. "Thomas Whitfield, we found you. We found your truth. We're sorry it took so long, but we promise you'll be remembered, not as a thief but as a hero, not with shame but with honor. Rest now. Your work is done." The crowd echoed, "Rest now." Bennett stood, pulling Evie and Rosie up with him, and together they approached the excavation site. Dr. Thornton allowed them close enough to see, close enough to bear witness. The bones were fragile, delicate, human, in a way that made Evie's nurse's heart ache with the knowledge of all the years this man had lain here alone, waiting, hoping someone would care enough to dig. 4 people lifted the metal box, using a winch system, the container emerging from the earth like something being born after an impossibly long gestation. The Union Pacific Railway seal was visible on top, embossed deep enough that rust had not obscured it, and Evie felt something loosen in her chest, some last knot of doubt finally releasing. Dr. Thornton turned to Evie, formal in this moment that required ceremony. "As the finder and the person who revealed Thomas Whitfield's evidence, you should be present when we open this." Evie approached on legs that felt disconnected from her body. Bennett stayed right beside her, and Grant positioned himself as official witness, while Victoria's phone camera captured everything for the legal record that would determine ownership distribution future. The tools doctor Thornton used to pry the corroded lid free seemed to take forever. Metal protesting with sounds that were almost organic 87 years of rust, fighting against release. The lid lifted slowly, hinges screaming their reluctance, and beneath was oilcloth partially deteriorated but still protecting what lay underneath. Doctor Thornton folded back the cloth with reverent care, and there they were, gold bars, not coins, but actual bullion, each stamped with the Union Pacific Railway seal dates ranging from 1936 to 1937, serial numbers still legible despite corrosion at the edges. The team removed each bar carefully, laying them out on protective cloth spread across the desert ground, and the counting happened aloud, the crowd joining in, 200 voices united in bearing witness to this moment. 1, 5, 10, 15, 20. Evie could not feel her hands, could not process what she was seeing, the gold gleaming dull in the sunlight, real and solid and impossible. 25, 30. Rosie was counting too, her young voice clear in the desert air, proud to be part of this, to understand in her own way the significance of numbers becoming real. 32, 33, 34. 34 bars total, each stamped 25 ounces. 850 ounces of gold at $2,000 per ounce equaled $1,700,000. The crowd's reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming, people crying, hugging strangers, celebrating a victory that belonged to a man who had been dead for nearly 90 years. Media helicopters circled overhead, cameras capturing everything, and Evie knew that by tonight this story would be on every news channel in the country. But she could not speak, could not do anything but cry while Rosie held her, and Bennett whispered, "Grandfather, grandfather," like a prayer or a promise, finally kept his face wet with tears that had waited 87 years to fall. Grant made the official statement to assembled media, his voice carrying the weight of law and justice finally converging. "This confirms everything Thomas Whitfield documented. This gold was stolen by Robert Caldwell from Union Pacific Railway between 1936 and 1938. Thomas Whitfield discovered the theft, gathered evidence, and was murdered to silence him. After 87 years, Thomas Whitfield's name is cleared. He was not a thief. He was a hero who died trying to do what was right." He held up the photograph of Thomas Whitfield that Bennett had provided, and the crowd's applause lasted 5 full minutes, wave after wave of sound rolling across the desert, across time, across the gap between injustice and its reckoning. 3 months passed in a blur of legal proceedings, DNA testing that confirmed the remains were indeed Thomas Whitfield, and a funeral attended by 800 people, where Bennett gave a eulogy that left no one unmoved. The Henderson estate agreed to settlement without prolonged court battles, 70% to Evie, 30% to Margaret. Preston Caldwell's final appeal was denied, and Robert Caldwell was now officially recorded in state history as a thief and murderer. Evie's share after taxes and legal fees was $1,190,000. She made her decisions carefully. Debts paid, emergency fund, established train car property purchased from Margaret Restoration, completed Rosie's college fund, secured at $400,000, and the Thomas Whitfield Memorial Scholarship Fund, endowed with $300,000 to honor 5 students annually. But the most significant moment came at the first scholarship ceremony that March. After 5 deserving students received their awards, an elderly man approached Evie with the careful steps of someone for whom movement had become difficult. "Miss Blackwood, I'm Nathaniel Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield was my uncle, my mother's older brother." Evie's heart stopped. Nathaniel explained he was born in 1943, that his mother, Sarah, had been Thomas's younger sister, and she had never stopped believing her brother was innocent, carrying that faith until her death in 1998. "I brought something." His hands shook as he pulled out a velvet bag, tipping a gold locket into Evie's palm. Delicate, engraved with railroad tracks stretching toward a horizon, and inside a tiny photograph of Thomas and an inscription. "To Sarah, with love from your brother Thomas. May your path always lead to better destinations." Nathaniel's voice was firm despite his tears. "Thomas gave this to my mother for her birthday in 37 months before he vanished. She wore it every day until she died. I want you to have it. Your family now. Anyone who fights for my uncle's memory the way you have, your family." Evie accepted the locket with trembling hands, and they embraced, strangers connected across generations by courage and justice and stories that refused to die. 6 months later, Bennett proposed in the restored train car, now gleaming with deep blue paint and gold trim, exactly as it had looked in 1938. He knelt with his grandfather Thomas's wedding ring, the one Bennett's mother Rose had kept her entire life. "My grandfather's ring for the woman who honored his memory, if you'll have us," Rosie added immediately. "Please, Mama, say yes. I want Bennett to be my dad." Evie said yes through tears, said yes to this man who had shown her that broken things could be made whole, that courage could transcend time, that love could grow in the harshest soil if you tended it with care. 2 years later, Evie stood on the steps of the fully restored train car, watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. Rosie was 8 now, thriving in 3rd grade, telling her classmates about Thomas Whitfield with pride. Bennett's restoration business had grown, though he stayed selective about projects. Evie still worked at the hospital 3 days a week because she loved nursing. The train car had become a place of pilgrimage, with visitors arriving from around the world to see where truth had hidden for 87 years, where one woman's desperation had led to one man's vindication. Rosie's voice broke the silence. "Mama, do you think Mr. Thomas knows we found his treasure, knows his story is told?" Evie pulled her daughter close, feeling Bennett's arm around them both. "I believe he does, baby. I believe he's been watching all along." Bennett's voice carried certainty born from finding purpose after years of drift. The real treasure wasn't gold. It was connection across time, proof that one person's stand for truth can echo through decades and transform lives not yet lived. Inside the train car's hidden compartment sat Nathaniel's locket, alongside copies of all Thomas's documents and Evie's own journal, the final entry reading, "Thomas, if you're watching, and I believe you are, thank you. Thank you for trusting that someone would come. I was that someone. Your story will be told as long as I live, as long as anyone who loves this train car lives. You gave me a treasure beyond gold. I give you immortality." The stars emerged over the Nevada desert, infinite points of light, unmarred by compromise. The train car stood solid on tracks that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, no longer traveling, but having completed its true journey from workplace to witness to sanctuary to home. And in the gathering darkness, Evie understood what Thomas Whitfield had known 87 years ago, that some truths were worth any price, that courage was not the absence of fear but action. Despite it, that one person willing to stand for what was right could change everything, even if they never lived to see it. The train car creaked softly in the night wind, and somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, Evie felt the presence of all those who had come before, all those who had fought and sacrificed and believed that truth would prevail. They had been right. Truth had prevailed. Justice had come. And the train car that had waited 87 years for the right person now held new stories, new proof that the arc of history, though long, bent toward light.